Chapter 7. The Day of Court. All rise. The Honorable Judge Rebecca Cole presides. Everyone in the courtroom stood up. Judge Cole walked to her bench and said, "You may be seated." "Good morning," she said, as she sipped a nice, cold glass of water. Still standing in the courtroom were Paul Storm and Danny Marcia. "Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Paul Storm from the District Attorney's Office," he said. "Yes, Your Honor. My name is Danny Marcia, and I am representing on behalf of my client who stands accused." They both sat down. Judge Cole went through her folder and started looking over the case. "It's my understanding that this is a jury trial, and Mark Taylor is accused of first-degree murder. I see he has entered a plea of not guilty. Is there anything else we need to be aware of before we start this trial?" Paul said, "No, Your Honor, we're ready to begin." "Okay, bailiff, you may bring the jury out so that we can begin." Mark sat next to his attorney, wearing a triple black Marc Jacobs suit. He was dressed to a T. In front of him on the table was a glass of orange juice, a pen, and a notepad so he could keep notes as the trial went on. The courtroom was packed. News reporters hung outside the courtroom and courthouse in hopes that, once the trial was over, they could question anyone who walked out of that courtroom. Jessica's family all showed up, still in grief. They sat in the front row, right behind the district attorney. Ralph was sitting a few rows behind the family. It was a jury of 12, consisting of white, black, and Hispanic individuals between the ages of 24 and 45. Judge Cole took another drink of her water and said, "The court is ready to hear the opening statements." "Yes, Your Honor." Danny stood up and said, "My client stands accused of murder in the first degree. I am here today to prove my client, Mark Taylor, is not a murderer and stands accused of a crime he didn't commit. The officers violated my client's rights. I believe that all evidence should be sufficient and correct before an officer decides to charge anyone for a crime as severe as this one. Now my client is on trial, fighting for his life, and I will prove his innocence. Thank you, Your Honor. I have nothing further." Paul stood up. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm here to prove that, in fact, Mark Taylor did indeed murder Jessica Bennett, and the evidence will back it up 100%. Not only am I here on behalf of the state, but I'm also here on behalf of the family, the same family that wants justice for Jessica. Thank you, and that will be all for now, Your Honor." Paul sat down with confidence and popped his collar, letting Danny know he had this case in the bag. Danny looked over at him, tapping his pen on his bottom lip, thinking to himself that the DA had no idea what was about to unfold. "Okay, after hearing both opening statements, the state can call its first witness," Judge Cole said as she leaned back. "Yes, Your Honor, I would like to call Miss Dorothy Jacobs to the stand." A side door opened and a short, elderly woman came out and headed to the stand. The court officer walked over to where she was standing. "Ma'am, state your name for the record." "Dorothy Jacobs." He handed her a Bible. She placed her right hand on the Bible. Then the officer asked her, "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "Yes," she said. "Okay, ma'am, you may be seated." She sat down, and the court officer walked away. "Good morning, ma'am. My name is Paul Storm, and I'm the district attorney. I just have a few questions for you. I will not try to take up too much of your time." Miss Dorothy nodded and said, "Okay." Paul: "Where do you live?" Miss Jacobs: 615 Walnut Street. Paul: "And where is that located?" Miss Jacobs: "In the Germantown section of Philadelphia." Paul: "Do you know Jessica?" Miss Jacobs: "Yes, I do." Paul: "And how well do you know her?" Miss Jacobs: "Pretty well." Paul: "Okay, Miss Jacobs, can you tell the court your relationship with the victim?" Miss Jacobs: Well, Jessica was my neighbor, and she used to come by and help me around the house. She was a young girl. I still can't see why anyone would want to kill her. Every morning she would bring me coffee, nice and black, just like I like it. But after a few months, I could see a change in her. She stopped coming by, and I noticed she and Mr. Bennett started to fight a lot. Paul: Did you think Jessica was cheating on Mr. Bennett? Danny: Objection. That answer would be a matter of opinion and is irrelevant to this case. Paul: Your Honor, I'm just merely asking if she felt like Jessica was cheating, which is very relevant to the case and a possible motive for her death. Judge Cole: Overruled. Paul: Let me rephrase the question. Did Jessica ever speak about another man besides Mr. Bennett? Miss Jacobs: No, she was so in love with Mr. Bennett. Paul: So it's safe to say the two were in love? Miss Jacobs: Yes. Paul: You said in a report that you saw a man walking around the house at the time of the murder, correct? Miss Jacobs: Yes. Paul: And did you recognize Mark as the man walking around the home that day? Miss Jacobs: I'm not too sure. It was hard to see with the hat on. Paul: Okay, ma'am. Thank you. I have no further questions, Your Honor. Paul knew her statement didn't matter because Mark was the only one there at the time of the murder, and he had her blood on his shirt, and an eyewitness stating that he was seen entering the home at the time of the murder. Judge Cole: Do you have any questions for the witness, Mr. Marcia? Danny looked over at Miss Jacobs, still sitting in his chair. He stood up and said, I have just a few questions, Your Honor. Danny: Good morning, Miss Jacobs. Miss Jacobs: Good morning. Danny: Take your time. No one is rushing you, okay, ma'am? Miss Jacobs: Okay. Danny: Have you seen my client, Mr. Taylor, at the home before the day of the murder? Miss Jacobs: No. Danny: Well, did you see my client at the home the day of the murder? Miss Jacobs: I just saw a man wearing a baseball cap walking to the front door. Danny: And did you see Jessica open the door for my client? Miss Jacobs: I couldn't see that well from where I was standing. Danny: So is it safe to say you did not see Jessica? Miss Jacobs: Yes, you can say that. Danny: No further questions, Your Honor. Danny took a deep breath and told Mark, Listen, I might have to put you on the stand. Just remember what we talked about. I'm pretty sure the DA has something up his sleeve, and I want to be well prepared. Judge Cole: Okay, ma'am. You may step down. Miss Jacobs stood up with the help of the court officer, and he led her to the back. Once Miss Jacobs was gone from the courtroom, Paul stood up and said, Your Honor, the state calls Miss Betty Green to the stand. Miss Green came out of the same door that Miss Jacobs came out of. She sat down and smiled. Paul was leaning on the edge of the table, looking calm, cool, and confident. Once he saw Miss Green was comfortable, he started his questions. Paul: Miss Green, how long have you been living on Walnut Lane? Miss Green: About 20 years now. Paul: And how long have you been doing town watch? Miss Green: Going on 15 years next month. Paul: So it's safe to say you know the neighborhood pretty well. Miss Green: Yes. Paul: So if anything were to look out of place, what's the protocol? Miss Green: To report any suspicious activity. Paul: So did you see the defendant on the day of the murder? Miss Green: Yes, I'm pretty sure. Paul: Let it be known to the court that Miss Green identified Mr. Taylor. So, Miss Green, what did you see on the day of the murder? Miss Green: I saw him get out of a white car and walk towards the house. At first, I thought he was a burglar until I saw the front door open. But before he walked into the house, he turned and looked at me. We caught eye contact for about a second or so. Then he walked into the house. Paul. So, did Jessica open the door for him? Miss Green. She had to open it because her husband's car wasn't out front. Paul. And when you say her husband's car wasn't out front, that would mean he wasn't home at the time, correct? Miss Green. Yes, I guess so. I just know his car wasn't parked in the front where he usually parks it. Paul. So, ma'am, how were you able to see all of this? Miss Green. I live directly across the street from them. Paul. Which means you have a clear view of the Bennett's home. Miss Green. Yes, I do. Paul. And no one else came in or out of the home. Miss Green. No, not from what I saw. Paul. No further questions, Your Honor. Paul slowly walked to his table, looking at Danny and Mark, and whispered to Danny, "Top that." Judge Cole. Your witness, Mr. Marcia? But Danny didn't hear her. Judge Cole. Excuse me, Mr. Marcia, it's your witness. Danny. Sorry, Your Honor. Danny was caught up in writing notes when the judge called for him to cross-examine the witness. Once Danny finished writing and overlooked his notes, he stood up prepared and ready to go. Danny. Okay, ma'am. You said you saw my client at the home, correct? Miss Green. Yes. Danny. And you stated that you got a good look at him, correct? Miss Green. Yes. Danny walked over to his table and grabbed a document. Paul started to look at Danny, confused, and started to wonder where he was going with this. Danny then walked back over to Miss Green and handed her the document and said, Danny. Ma'am, what is this? Miss Green. It's a copy of my eye exam. Danny. Do you know why I'm holding this? Paul. Objection, Your Honor. What does Miss Green's eye exam have to do with this? I believe this is irrelevant, Your Honor. Danny. Your Honor, I'm clearly making a point of what Miss Green saw and didn't see the day of the murder. Judge Cole. Sustained. I will let it go. Hurry and make your point, Mr. Marcia. Danny. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge Cole. Go ahead, ma'am. You can answer the question. Miss Green. I don't know why I'm holding this. Danny. Okay, let me refresh your memory. Do you need glasses to see far away? Miss Green. Yes, I do. Danny. And is it correct that you have poor vision when looking far away? Miss Green. Yes, I mainly use my glasses to see far away, especially driving. Danny. And is it correct that in your exam, you are nearsighted? Miss Green. Yes. Paul started to go through his paperwork, wondering where Danny was getting this from. Fuck, I'm screwed, Paul said. Danny walked back to his table, laid down the eye exam document, and grabbed a statement Miss Green made. He went back over to her and said, Danny, is this your signature? Miss Green. Yes. Danny turned to the jury and said, I hold in my hand a signed statement from Miss Green. Danny. Miss Green, can you read this out loud, please? Danny pointed at the highlighted sentence, and Miss Green started to read. Miss Green. When I noticed he wasn't a burglar, I took a seat in my living room, put on my glasses, and started watching TV. Danny. Thank you, ma'am. Paul was pissed. You could see him getting as red as a stop sign. Danny turned to the jury confidently and said, If you put your glasses on when you went into the house, That means you didn't have them on when you were outside when you said you saw my client. And from your house to the Bennett's, that's a pretty nice distance away for a person who can only see what's in front of them. So, tell me, how in the world can someone with your eyesight see that far away without wearing their glasses? Miss Green couldn't say anything. She knew he had caught her. She just sat there, quiet as a church mouse. You could see Paul pinching the corners of his eyes, getting more frustrated. Jeff was sitting in the back and could remember what Amy had told him, and he smiled. I guess she was right after all, Jeff thought to himself. Danny turned to the judge and said, No further questions, Your Honor.